You were promised peace at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel keeps moving. He followed the plan, worked 40 years without much complaint, paid his taxes, contributed to a 401k, skipped the new car, postponed the vacation. He made the responsible choices, believing the math would eventually reward him. That's what everyone said. Save now, enjoy later. But later is here, and it doesn't feel like freedom. His body aches more than it used to. Healthcare costs more than it used to. And that retirement account? It barely covers his monthly expenses, let alone anything that feels like life. He's not alone. According to national data, nearly 60% of Americans approaching retirement have far less than they need. Most can't afford to stop working, not because they didn't try, but because the numbers were never on their side. The costs went up, the goalposts moved, the system quietly changed while they were busy following the rules. And now they're stuck in a paradox. They did everything they were told, but the promised reward feels like another form of work, just without the paycheck. The real question isn't, did they save enough? The question is, why did we believe this story in the first place? Retirement was sold as a guarantee, a light at the end of the tunnel. But no one mentioned that the tunnel might never end. No one talked about how fragile that promise was, how tied it was to market performance, healthcare inflation, or political stability. And yet, millions built their lives around it. They sacrificed decades of energy, ambition, and time with loved ones, all for a future that may never arrive. It's time to ask what no one wants to say out loud. What if the promise was always flawed? What if retirement was never about freedom, but about compliance, patience, and managed expectations? What if the whole system was designed to keep people waiting, not living? Retirement was never created to reward you. It was built to remove you. Most people think retirement is a human right, a natural phase of life that rewards decades of labor with rest. But historically, that's not why retirement exists. The modern retirement age we take for granted, 65, wasn't created because that's when the body or mind stops functioning. It was created to move people out of the way. The first version of state-sponsored retirement came from Germany in the 1880s, when Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced pensions for citizens over 70. At the time, the average life expectancy was 45. Statistically, most workers would die before they ever collected a cent. It wasn't a plan to support the elderly. It was a political strategy to control unrest and reduce pressure on labor markets. In the U.S., retirement as we know it didn't become widespread until after the Great Depression. Social Security was introduced not just to support the aging population, but to stimulate economic movement and reduce unemployment by encouraging older workers to leave the workforce. It was less about care and more about economic utility. This wasn't a system built on generosity. It was a lever to shift labor dynamics. People were encouraged to step aside so that younger, cheaper workers could take their place. The promise of retirement was a trade. Give us your prime years, your energy, your silence, and we'll give you peace at the end. But what no one said out loud was that the peace was never guaranteed. It was conditional, political, economic. And as the decades passed, the promise remained, even as the conditions changed. The retirement age of 65 was frozen in time, but the world moved forward. People now live 20-30 years longer than when the system was designed. Healthcare costs skyrocketed, the economy became more volatile, and yet the structure stayed the same, leaving millions underprepared for a reality their grandparents never had to face. What was once a clever form of industrial-era population management is now a fragile fantasy people cling to. But the math doesn't lie. Retirement was never engineered to support the lives we live today. It was engineered to move people off the books, quietly, permanently, and with minimal cost to the system that used them. Understanding this doesn't make it easier, but it makes it clearer. Retirement, in its original form, was not designed for your freedom. It was designed to make you disappear when you were no longer economically efficient. Your retirement isn't guaranteed, it's gamified, and you're not the house. The modern retirement system, 401ks, IRAs, pension funds, gives off the appearance of structure, but underneath, it's a fragile web of market speculation, optimistic assumptions, and shifting demographics. The idea that you can work for 40 years, consistently contribute to a retirement account, and then safely withdraw 4% a year until you die sounds mathematically sound, until you realize how many variables that model quietly ignores. Longevity risk, inflation, healthcare spikes, market crashes, tax changes, all of them threaten the very foundation that most people rely on without question. The 401k was never designed to be the primary retirement vehicle. It was created in the late 1970s as a tax-deferred savings option for executives. But when corporations realized they could offload the responsibility of pensions onto workers, it became the new default. Suddenly, the burden of retirement shifted from the employer to the employee. You were no longer promised a pension. You were offered a chance to build one, on your own, in a volatile market, with zero guarantees. The irony: most people think they're investing for freedom, but in reality, they're funding a system that makes billions off their hope. Asset management companies, mutual fund providers, and brokerages profit, whether your retirement grows or fails. They earn fees on the assets you entrust to them, regardless of outcome. Every contribution you make feeds an industry that thrives on scale, not security. You think you're building wealth, but the truth is, unless you understand how the system works, you're mostly building it for them. And beyond that, the demographic math is breaking. Fewer workers are supporting more retirees. Pension funds in many cities and states are underfunded or nearing collapse. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted in the coming decades unless major reforms happen. Everyone knows the cracks are there, but no one wants to say it too loudly. Because fear causes exits, and exits break the system faster. We're living in a house of cards, one that depends on belief, participation, and delay. If too many people try to exit at once, or if the market underperforms for even a few years, the illusion collapses. But the messaging stays the same. Stay the course. Trust the plan. Delay gratification. Why? Because your participation sustains the game, not your freedom. Retirement isn't just a financial plan, it's a psychological trap. People don't cling to retirement because of spreadsheets or compound interest charts. They cling to it because it gives meaning to their suffering. Later becomes the story they tell themselves to justify the weight they carry now. The long commutes, the toxic bosses, the hours lost in meetings, the missed birthdays, the vacations they skip, the stress they swallow. All of it gets stored in a mental vault labeled, "It will be worth it someday." That promise soothes the discomfort. It makes endurance feel noble. But what happens when someday arrives and nothing feels like enough? The idea of delayed reward isn't new. Psychologists have studied it for decades. The famous marshmallow test showed how children who could delay gratification often did better in life. But here's what the headlines missed. In many follow-ups, the real factor behind delayed gratification wasn't willpower. It was trust. Children who came from stable environments, where promises were kept, were more likely to wait. Children who experienced inconsistency didn't trust that later would come. And so they took what they could now. And maybe they were right. In our society, the myth of retirement depends on the same kind of blind trust. Work now, enjoy later. Except the later isn't guaranteed. Not financially, not biologically, not systemically. But the messaging is relentless. From ads to HR departments to financial advisors, we're told that sacrifice now is the mark of intelligence. That saving for the future is what responsible adults do. That the discomfort is temporary. And that one day we'll be free. But here's the hidden cost. When you train people to delay joy, they become experts at tolerating pain. They learn to suppress instinct. They postpone not just spending, but living. They stop asking for better in the present because they're too invested in the future. That's not strategy. That's emotional sedation. And the system loves it. Because people who believe in later don't ask too many questions now. They don't rebel. They don't shift careers. They don't challenge the pace. They just wait. For permission. For peace. For the version of life they were promised. But waiting becomes a habit. And then it becomes an identity. And before they realize it, decades pass. And they've mastered endurance, but forgotten how to live. And the promise they held onto? It turns into a quiet disappointment, too deep to name, too subtle to scream. The truth is, if the only reason you're surviving today is for something tomorrow might never bring, then you're not living. You're trading your time for hope that isn't even yours. Pension collapse isn't a theory. It's a history lesson. Most people think the idea of retirement failing is a hypothetical, a fear used to sell more financial products or spark political debates. But pension collapse isn't abstract. It has already happened, in countries, in cities, in individual lives, and it left people broken. Not just financially, but emotionally. Because nothing cuts deeper than realizing the future you sacrificed for no longer exists. Look at Argentina. In 2008, the government seized $30 billion in private pension funds under the promise of stabilization. Overnight, citizens who thought they were protected had their accounts taken, absorbed into state control. The funds were never returned. In Greece, austerity measures during the debt crisis led to massive pension cuts. Retirees saw their monthly income slashed by 40 to 50% in a matter of months. People who were once middle class became dependent on their children, or left to survive with scraps. And it's not just other countries. In the US, entire municipal pension funds have collapsed or come dangerously close. Detroit filed for bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Thousands of public employees who had worked for decades suddenly faced reduced benefits, legal battles, and a brutal realization. The promises made to them had no real foundation. Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey, all have pension systems labeled as severely underfunded, with billions in deficits. And these are just the public cases. Countless smaller corporate pensions have quietly disappeared through restructuring, buyouts, or economic downturns. The problem isn't just poor planning, it's systemic overpromising. Politicians and corporations built retirement models on projections that assumed endless growth, perfect demographics, and cooperative economies. But when real life hit, with aging populations, longer lifespans, inflation, and economic shocks, the numbers stopped working. And instead of fixing the structure, most institutions just changed the rules, raised the retirement age, shifted responsibility to individuals, cut benefits quietly. So while people still talk about retirement as a someday, the architecture holding it up is already crumbling. And the most dangerous part? Most people won't see it until it's too late, until their statement shows a smaller number than expected, until a letter arrives saying, due to market conditions, until the thing they trusted collapses under the weight of reality. This isn't fear-mongering, it's precedent. And in a system built on trust, every collapse shatters more than money. It destroys belief in the future, in institutions, in fairness. And when belief dies, so does the reason people stay in line. Retirement doesn't collapse in theory. It collapses in silence, and then overnight. In Argentina, the government nationalized private pension funds in 2008. Millions of people woke up one morning to find that the money they had been saving for decades was no longer theirs. It was absorbed for the public good. In Greece, during the debt crisis, pensions were cut again and again. People who were promised a stable retirement suddenly had to return to work at 70, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. These weren't corrupt, failed states. They were functioning democracies, operating under economic pressure, the kind of pressure every modern system is now quietly accumulating. In the US, the cracks are already visible. State and city pension funds, especially in places like Illinois, Kentucky, and New Jersey, are underfunded by hundreds of billions of dollars. Some cities have quietly cut benefits, raised the retirement age, or shifted risk back onto workers. Private companies phased out pensions long ago. Social Security, once the backbone of retirement, is projected to become insolvent in the next 10-15 years unless significant changes are made. And yet, the narrative hasn't changed. People still believe in the promise, still plan their lives around it, still assume the system will be there for them. But what happens when the system isn't? The collapse of a retirement plan doesn't look like an explosion. It looks like quiet desperation. Seniors going back to work at Walmart. Couples downsizing not by choice, but by necessity. Grown children moving their aging parents back into their homes because the monthly checks don't cover the basics. There's no headline for that. No financial advisor rings the alarm. Because the system needs you to keep believing, even when it's already failing. And it is failing, not all at once, but piece by piece. Through inflation, through market volatility, through rising healthcare costs that consume savings faster than they can grow, through administrative fees that eat away at compound interest, through political paralysis that leaves real reform impossible. When a pension fund runs out of money, no one calls it theft. They call it restructuring. When Social Security faces shortfalls, no one admits it's broken. They call it a funding gap. But to the people who trusted those systems, it feels the same. The promise breaks, the tunnel ends, and there's no light. And when that happens, the question isn't, how did this happen? The real question is, why did we wait so long to see it coming? You're not saving for your future. You're feeding the machine that profits from your waiting. Look closely at the mechanics of the retirement system, and something unsettling emerges. You're told to save diligently, invest through tax-advantaged vehicles, contribute every month without fail. But where does that money actually go? Into funds you don't control, into institutions you don't own, into markets that can crash overnight, and into the pockets of managers who get paid whether you win or lose. The irony is brutal. The system is built so that you assume all the risk, but they capture all the consistent upside. The structure is circular by design. You get taxed on your income, then encouraged to shelter some of it in a retirement account. That account grows, slowly, unevenly, while being siphoned by management fees and inflation erosion. When you finally reach the age of access, you pay taxes again when you withdraw. Meanwhile, the very companies running your funds are lobbying for tax rules, designing new products, and collecting a piece of every dollar in motion. It's not fraud, it's the business model. Even more insidious is the illusion that your contributions are personal wealth building. But in many ways, you're just paying yourself forward with hope that the rules don't change, the market doesn't collapse, and your health doesn't deteriorate too soon. In reality, you're deferring your quality of life into a future built on variables you don't control. It's not a vault, It's a mirror, one that reflects your belief in the story, not your actual freedom. And behind that mirror is a government that quietly relies on your obedience. Social Security, Medicare, public pensions, all funded by the present working class for a growing retiree base. It's a pay-as-you-go system disguised as personal entitlement. But as demographics shift and more people retire than enter the workforce, the math becomes unsustainable. The system wasn't built for long-term solvency. It was built for short-term belief. That belief is what keeps the wheels turning, what keeps people quiet, what makes them tolerate decades of stagnation, because they've been told they're investing in themselves. But the truth? They're fueling a machine that monetizes time, trust, and inaction, and calls it security. Retirement is not for everyone. It was never meant to be. For the wealthy, retirement doesn't look like escape. It looks like evolution. They don't wait until 65 to start living. They build systems early, ownership, investments, influence, that free them from the need to trade time for money. When they step back from day-to-day work, they don't disappear. They reappear in different forms, as board members, investors, advisors, mentors. Retirement, for them, is not the end of value. It's the expansion of it. Contrast that with the middle class, who are taught to believe that retirement is the goal. Not freedom, not ownership, not impact, just retirement. A vague promise that after decades of sacrifice, they'll finally get to live. But what does that life actually look like? For most, it's fixed income, budget restrictions, rising healthcare costs, anxiety around longevity, a quieter form of stress. The dream was sold with warm language, but delivered in cold numbers. The deeper issue isn't just money, it's design. Wealthy people were never trained to think in terms of retirement. They think in terms of cash flow, leverage, optionality. They build toward independence, not exit. Meanwhile, the rest are taught to behave. Follow the steps, be patient, be quiet, save a little, wait, obey. And maybe, just maybe, the system will reward them. This is not conspiracy, it's culture. Retirement is the social script handed to the majority to keep them aligned, pacified, predictable. It's not an accident that the most promoted financial goal is one that keeps you deferring joy, delaying autonomy, and depending on external systems to grant you permission to live. Because if most people believed they could live well before 65, they'd start making different choices. They'd ask harder questions. They'd demand more freedom now, and that would make them harder to manage. So, no, retirement isn't for everyone. It's for those who can afford to wait, or for those taught they have no other choice. But there is another choice. And that's what comes next. The wealthy don't retire, they reposition. Retirement is a script, but not for them. If retirement were truly the reward for a life of hard work, then why do the wealthiest people never seem to retire? Why do billionaires keep building, investing, and expanding their empires well into their 70s and 80s? Not because they have to, but because the game they're playing was never about escape. It was about leverage, legacy, and control. Retirement, as most people imagine it, isn't a reward. It's a script, designed for the middle class to follow, so the system stays orderly and predictable. The upper class never relied on pensions. They never planned their lives around 401ks. Their freedom doesn't come from withdrawing 4% a year at 67. It comes from owning assets that produce income now, not later. It comes from liquidity, trust structures, equity stakes, and businesses that continue to grow whether they work or not. For them, retirement is a meaningless word. They don't stop. They shift from operators to strategists, from CEOs to chairmen, from hands-on to hands-free, while the income never stops flowing. Meanwhile, The middle class is handed a script: work 40 years, defer joy, save what you can, and hope the math works out. This isn't freedom. It's behavioral management. A social structure built to keep people focused on later, so they don't rebel now. So they don't ask for too much. So they don't take risks that disrupt the system. Retirement is not distributed equally. It was never meant to be. For those at the top, it's irrelevant. For those in the middle, it's often unreachable. And for those at the bottom, it's simply a word that means, keep working until you physically can't. The very idea of earning the right to rest after decades of economic servitude sounds noble, until you realize how deeply it depends on obedience, not empowerment. Ask yourself this: if retirement is supposed to be the final chapter of freedom, why is it only available to those who never needed it? Because real freedom doesn't begin at 65. It begins when your income is no longer tied to your labor, when your time is no longer owned by a clock, when your life is no longer structured by systems that were never built with you in mind. Retirement is not the goal. Ownership is. And the people who truly win don't retire. They escape the need to. Freedom isn't a finish line. It's a system you build. Now. For decades, you've been told that freedom comes later. That if you play the game right, follow the rules, contribute quietly, delay your desires, you'll eventually reach that magic age when everything opens up. But that promise has already failed millions. And if you're honest with yourself, you probably feel it too. That quiet tension in your chest that whispers, I don't want to wait anymore. The truth is, retirement was never freedom. It was a delay, a deferral of life, a polite way to move people out of the workforce while making them believe they were moving up. But in today's world, where volatility is normal, costs keep rising, and no institution can truly guarantee your safety, waiting is no longer a strategy. It's a gamble. So what's the alternative? You build your freedom in motion. You stop thinking in terms of retirement and start thinking in terms of control, of income, of time, of attention. You focus not on stacking dollars in a distant account, but on building assets that pay you now. Skills that no recession can take. Streams of revenue that aren't capped by an employer. Flexibility that lets you pivot. Liquidity that buys you options. Freedom isn't about escaping work. It's about doing work that doesn't trap you. It's about having systems that move with you, not against you. And most of all, it's about realizing that no one is coming to rescue you. Not the government, not a pension fund, not the market. If you want freedom, you have to define it, build it, live it. Now. Not at 65, not when they tell you it's time, but the moment you decide the game isn't worth playing on their terms. This isn't about fear. It's about clarity. Because once you stop waiting for permission, you start creating power. So, here's the shift. Don't plan your life around retirement. Plan it around autonomy. You don't need to escape work. You need to escape dependence. And that starts the moment you stop believing the biggest lie of the modern economy and start designing your life like the system was never built for you. Because it wasn't. But now you know.